The mahogany doors of courtroom 347 creaked open as Sarah Anderson walked in, her heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor, while morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the tense faces of the gathered spectators. Her perfectly pressed charcoal suit and composed demeanor seemed oddly out of place for someone facing serious weapons charges as she made her way to the defendant's table with an air of quiet confidence that unsettled the seasoned bailiff. The gallery whispered among themselves as they watched this elegant black woman who seemed more like a corporate executive than a criminal. Some of them had already made up their minds based on the local papers' sensational coverage of the arrest, while others noticed something unusual in her calm, analytical gaze as she studied each person in the room. Officer James Thompson adjusted his collar for the third time while sitting in the witness box. His partner, Officer Michael Reynolds, stood against the back wall trying to project confidence, but his fingers nervously tapped against his service weapon. The carefully planned testimony was about to begin, and the weight of the moment pressed down on both of them like a physical force. District Attorney William Porter rose from his chair, his expensive suit barely concealing his eagerness to secure another conviction in this high-profile case that had captured the media's attention. His voice carried across the hushed courtroom as he began questioning Officer Thompson about the events of that fateful night on Ridge Road. The jury, a homogeneous group of 12 white residents from the affluent suburbs, leaned forward in their seats as Thompson described the routine traffic stop that led to the discovery of what he claimed was an arsenal in the trunk of Sarah's Mercedes, their faces reflecting the subtle bias that had made this prosecution possible in the first place. Sarah remained perfectly still, her shoulders back and chin held high as she listened to the officers fabricate their story about suspicious behavior and probable cause, her dark eyes never leaving Thompson's face as he testified, making him increasingly uncomfortable, though no one else seemed to notice the slight tremor in his voice or the way he kept adjusting his tie. Defense Attorney James Chen sat beside Sarah reviewing his notes, but those who looked closely might have noticed the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, as if he knew something that would turn this entire proceeding on its head, his calm demeanor matching his client's in a way that seemed to irritate the prosecutor. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting different shadows through the vintage courthouse windows as Officer Thompson described finding the weapons, his testimony seeming rehearsed yet confident, while Sarah maintained her enigmatic composure, her fingers occasionally typing subtle notes on a slim tablet that seemed to contain far more than just legal documents. Members of the local press scribbled furiously in their notepads, certain they were documenting what would be another swift conviction in a justice system that rarely favored defendants who looked like Sarah, yet something about her presence commanded attention and suggested that this case might not follow the usual script. Judge Harrison observed the proceedings from his elevated bench, his decades of experience telling him that something was different about this case, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was, as he watched the defendant maintain her remarkable poise despite the damaging testimony being leveled against her. The air in the courtroom grew thicker with tension as Officer Thompson moved through his account of discovering the suspicious duffel bag, his partner, Officer Reynolds, nodding along from his position near the gallery, while Sarah continued her careful observation of every detail, every gesture, and every reaction in the room, as if she were the one gathering evidence rather than the one on trial. District Attorney Porter moved away from his table with calculated precision, his Italian leather shoes making soft sounds against the aged courtroom floor as he began to paint his picture of threat and danger to the community, his voice rising and falling with practiced emotion while he gestured towards Sarah Anderson, who remained an island of calm in the storm of his theatrics. The prosecutor's face grew flushed with enthusiasm as he described the supposed arsenal found in Sarah's car, his words carefully chosen to evoke fear and bias in the jury members, who shifted uncomfortably in their seats while stealing glances at the composed defendant, whose slight smile seemed to unsettle them even more than the accusations being hurled across the courtroom. Beads of sweat began forming on Officer Thompson's forehead as he watched the prosecutors spin their carefully constructed narrative, his fingers drumming silently against his knee, while his partner, Officer Reynolds, maintained a stoic expression that seemed increasingly forced as Sarah continued her unnervingly steady observation of their every movement and micro expression. The morning sun had climbed higher, now casting harsh shadows across the courtroom floor as Porter produced photographs of the weapons, his voice dropping to a dramatic whisper as he described each item to the jury. Yet something about the evidence seemed too perfect, too neatly arranged, like props on a stage, rather than contraband discovered during a routine traffic stop. Sarah typed something on her tablet, causing her defense attorney Chen to suppress a knowing smile, while Porter continued his performance, unaware that his dramatic gestures and impassioned rhetoric were playing directly into a scenario that Sarah herself might have orchestrated, her dark eyes tracking his movement like a master strategist watching an opponent walk into a carefully laid trap. The gallery had grown fuller as word spread through the courthouse about the dramatic testimony. Local reporters scribbled in their notebooks, while sketch artists captured Sarah's regal posture and unwavering demeanor, their pencils moving quickly across paper as if they sensed they were documenting something far more significant than a routine weapons case. Porter approached the jury box, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone as he suggested that Sarah represented a dangerous element infiltrating their peaceful community, yet his words seemed to lose their impact as they crashed against her unshakable composure, some jurors beginning to wonder why this supposedly dangerous criminal seemed more collected than the officers who had arrested her. Officer Reynolds shifted his weight from one foot to another as Porter referenced his upcoming testimony, his discomfort becoming more apparent as Sarah turned her penetrating gaze toward him for a moment, causing him to look away first, while his hand unconsciously moved to adjust his collar in a gesture of anxiety that did not go unnoticed by the more observant members of the jury. The prosecutor's carefully crafted narrative began to show subtle cracks as he attempted to explain the coincidence of finding such an extensive weapons cache during a routine traffic stop, his previous confidence wavering slightly as he noticed Judge Harrison studying the evidence photos with an increasingly skeptical expression while making notes on his legal pad. Defense attorney Chen remained seated, but his relaxed posture suggested the confidence of someone holding a winning hand, while Porter continued his increasingly dramatic presentation, seeming almost desperate now to maintain the jury's attention as Sarah calmly wrote another note on her tablet, her composed movements a stark contrast to the nervous energy emanating from the prosecution table. The morning had stretched toward noon, and shafts of sunlight illuminated dancing dust motes in the air as Porter concluded his theatrical opening statement, his final flourish of righteous indignation seeming somehow hollow in the face of Sarah's unwavering self-possession, while Officer Thompson dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief and Officer Reynolds stared fixedly at a point on the far wall, both of them increasingly aware that their testimony would soon face far more scrutiny than they had anticipated. Defense attorney James Chen rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a martial artist, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light as he approached the witness stand where Officer Thompson sat, attempting to project an air of authority that seemed to diminish with each step Chen took toward him, the red folder in the attorney's hand drawing every eye in the courtroom. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Chen began his cross-examination, his voice carrying a gentle yet razor-sharp precision that made Officer Thompson shift uncomfortably in his seat, while Sarah Anderson continued her careful observation, her fingers moving across her tablet with increasing frequency, as if logging each revealing response and nervous gesture. Chen circled the witness stand like a chess master setting up his endgame, his questions starting deceptively simple about the weather conditions on Ridge Road that night, the exact position of Sarah's Mercedes, the specific timeline of events that led to the traffic stop, each answer from Thompson adding another piece to a puzzle that only Chen and his client seemed to fully understand. The gallery leaned forward in their seats as Chen produced official weather records from that evening showing no fog despite Officer Thompson's insistence that heavy fog had obscured his view, the officer's explanation growing more tangled as Chen methodically laid out satellite images showing clear skies, while Sarah typed something that made her lips curve in a knowing smile. Judge Harrison watched with growing interest as Chen projected a detailed map of Ridge Road onto the courtroom screen, his questions about specific locations and timing growing more precise. While Thompson began to contradict his earlier testimony, his partner's face darkening with concern from his position near the back of the courtroom as the carefully constructed narrative started showing dangerous cracks. The defense attorney moved with practiced precision through a series of questions about police protocols and standard procedures, his knowledge suggesting years of experience with law enforcement operations, while Thompson struggled to explain why he had deviated from these procedures during Sarah's traffic stop, his answers becoming increasingly defensive and inconsistent. Chen consulted his red folder with theatrical timing, pulling out time-stamped dispatch records that contradicted the officer's statement about when they had first spotted Sarah's vehicle. The documents projected onto the screen, causing a ripple of murmurs through the gallery, while Officer Reynolds unconsciously took a step toward the courtroom exit, his tactical belt jingling slightly with the movement. The jury's attention shifted between Chen and Thompson like spectators at a tennis match as the defense attorney systematically dismantled each element of the officer's testimony, his questions revealing inconsistencies in everything from the patrol route to the sequence of radio calls, while Sarah maintained her enigmatic composure as if watching a play whose ending she had already memorized. Afternoon shadows stretched across the courtroom floor as Chen produced maintenance records showing that the police cruiser's dash camera had been fully functional that night despite Thompson's claim of equipment failure. The officer's face growing pale as he realized the implications, while his partner Reynolds now stood with his back pressed against the wall, his right hand fidgeting near his weapon. The prosecutor rose to object several times, but each objection withered under Chen's meticulous preparation, his citations of precedent and procedure suggesting this was far more than a routine weapons case. While Thompson began to stammer through his responses, his earlier confidence crumbling like a sandcastle against the rising tide of contradictory evidence. Sarah watched the proceedings with the calculating gaze of someone who had orchestrated rather than stumbled into this moment, her occasional notes on the tablet seemingly coordinated with Chen's systematic exposure of the officer's fabrications, while the jury began showing signs of shifting allegiance, their earlier assumptions about guilt and innocence slowly transforming into uncomfortable doubt. The afternoon air grew thick with tension as defense attorney Chen approached the evidence table, his movements deliberately slow, while he opened a sleek laptop connected to the courtroom display system, the quiet hum of the projector the only sound breaking the expectant silence that had fallen over the assembled spectators like a heavy blanket. Officer Thompson gripped the edges of the witness stand, his knuckles whitening as Chen pressed a button causing the large screen to flicker to life with high-definition footage from a surveillance camera positioned on Ridge Road, the timestamp clearly visible in the corner showing exactly 20 minutes before the reported traffic stop, while Sarah leaned forward slightly, her first significant movement in hours. The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers as the crystal-clear video showed a police cruiser pulling up beside Sarah's parked Mercedes, the vehicle's light bar dark as officers Thompson and Reynolds emerged holding flashlights and what appeared to be a large duffel bag, their movements furtive and practiced like actors who had rehearsed this scene many times before. Judge Harrison removed his reading glasses, leaning forward with intense focus as the footage showed Reynolds keeping watch, while Thompson used a slim gym to unlock Sarah's car. The officer's earlier testimony about probable cause and suspicious behavior crumbling in the face of irrefutable video evidence that painted a very different picture of that night's events. The prosecutor jumped to his feet, shouting objections that died in his throat as Chen calmly produced documentation showing the surveillance footage had been properly obtained and authenticated by multiple independent experts, while Officer Reynolds unconsciously backed toward the courtroom door, his face ashen as his partner squirmed under the collective gaze of the transfixed jury. Sarah maintained her composed demeanor, but now a hint of satisfaction gleamed in her dark eyes as the video continued, showing Thompson placing items in her trunk with mechanical precision, while Reynolds coordinated via radio with unseen conspirators, the timestamp mercilessly documenting every second of their criminal activity. The footage shifted to a different angle, revealing the officers' careful positioning of weapons in Sarah's vehicle, their movements suggesting this was not their first time executing such an operation, while the jury members exchanged shocked glances, their earlier assumptions about guilt and innocence shattering like fine crystal dropped on concrete. Chen allowed the video to play without commentary, letting the damning evidence speak for itself, while Thompson seemed to physically shrink in the witness stand, his previous swagger replaced by the desperate look of a man watching his career and freedom crumbling before his eyes, his partner Reynolds now frozen in place like a deer in headlights. The courtroom temperature seemed to plummet as the footage showed the officers carefully arranging evidence, planting fingerprints, and staging the scene with professional precision, their actions revealing a level of corruption that went far beyond a simple traffic stop. While Sarah typed rapid notes on her tablet, her fingers moving with increased urgency. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as the video displayed Thompson making a phone call, his expression visible in the high-definition footage as he coordinated the upcoming traffic stop, his partner methodically wiping down surfaces and arranging the planted evidence to support their fabricated narrative of discovery. The prosecutor's face had taken on a greenish tint as he realized the magnitude of what was unfolding in his courtroom, his career and reputation now potentially entangled in a web of corruption that seemed to expand with each passing second of the surveillance footage, while Chen stood quietly letting the evidence demolish the case's foundation. As the video reached its conclusion, showing the officers departing only to return 20 minutes later with lights flashing to conduct their supposed routine traffic stops, Sarah finally allowed herself a small smile, her patience and planning vindicated, while Thompson stared at the floor, unable to meet the accusing gazes of the jury members who had so recently been sympathetic to his testimony. The heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom burst open with dramatic force as Director Marcus Hayes of the Central Intelligence Agency strode in, his commanding presence filling the space with an almost physical authority. 6 suited agents with earpieces and subtle bulges beneath their jackets filing in behind him, taking strategic positions around the perimeter of the courtroom, their movements precise and practiced. Sarah straightened almost imperceptibly in her chair, a microscopic gesture that nonetheless caught the attention of Officer Thompson, whose face had transformed from sickly pale to ghost white as he recognized the distinctive CIA windbreakers worn by another team of agents now entering through the side door, their movements suggesting a carefully choreographed operation. Director Hayes approached the bench, his custom-made Oxford shoes silent against the courthouse floor, as he withdrew a classified envelope bearing the distinctive seal of the Central Intelligence Agency, his silver hair and impeccable charcoal suit projecting an aura of absolute authority, while Judge Harrison studied him with a mixture of surprise and growing understanding. The gallery erupted in hushed whispers as Hayes presented his credentials to the judge, the sound like wind through autumn leaves, while Officer Reynolds finally abandoned his position near the exit, realizing that every possible escape route had been quietly and efficiently sealed by the CIA personnel, who now stood at attention, their eyes constantly scanning the room. Judge Harrison carefully broke the seal of the envelope, removing documents marked with various levels of classification, his eyes widening slightly as he read, while Director Hayes stood perfectly still, his presence reminiscent of a battlefield commander about to reveal a masterful strategy that had been months or perhaps years in the making. The prosecutor remained frozen in place, his objection dying on his lips as he watched the judge examine document after document, while Sarah maintained her position, her earlier supple smile now carrying a weight of professional satisfaction as years of careful undercover work culminated in this precisely orchestrated moment. Officer Thompson gripped the witness stand with trembling hands as Director Hayes turned to face the court, his steel grey eyes sweeping the room with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to managing international crises, while his team maintained their positions, their earpieces occasionally crackling with coded communications. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, creating dramatic shadows. As Judge Harrison finished reading the final document, his face displaying the careful neutrality of someone who had just discovered that the relatively simple case before him had transformed into something far more significant than anyone in the room had imagined. Chen stood quietly beside his client, his earlier confidence now revealed to be the assurance of someone who had been part of an intricately planned operation, while Sarah finally allowed her professional demeanor to display a hint of the highly trained operative that had been hiding in plain sight throughout the proceedings. The jury watched in rapt attention as Director Hayes nodded to Judge Harrison, a silent communication between two powerful figures that spoke volumes about the gravity of the situation, while Thompson and Reynolds seemed to physically diminish their earlier arrogance, replaced by the dawning realization that they had unknowingly targeted someone far beyond their comprehension. Several members of the gallery who had been taking notes suddenly closed their notebooks as their CIA credentials became visible. The seemingly random spectators, now revealed as part of an elaborate operation designed to document and observe every moment of the proceedings while maintaining their cover. The sunlight caught the edge of the classified documents as Judge Harrison prepared to address the court, the paper's edges gleaming like the blade of justice about to fall, while Director Hayes maintained his position, his very presence suggesting that the true scope of this case was about to expand far beyond a simple weapons charge in a local courthouse. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the now silent courtroom as he adjusted his reading glasses for the third time, his hands holding the classified documents with the gravity their contents deserved, while every eye in the room remained fixed on his weathered face as he prepared to shatter the foundations of everything they thought they knew about this case. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows seemed to pause as the judge began speaking, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades on the bench as he revealed that the defendant Sarah Anderson was in fact Senior Operations Officer Sarah Anderson, a decorated CIA operative with numerous commendations for her work in counterintelligence and anti-corruption operations, both domestic and international. Sarah rose from her seat, her transformation from defendant to CIA operative happening in the space of a heartbeat as her carefully maintained facade of quiet dignity evolved into the commanding presence of a highly trained intelligence officer, her posture and bearing now radiating the authority she had purposefully concealed throughout the proceedings. The jury sat in stunned silence as Judge Harrison continued reading, detailing how Sarah had spent the past 2 years orchestrating a deep cover operation to expose corruption within the local police department, her mission authorized at the highest levels of government, while several members of the gallery revealed themselves as fellow CIA operatives by moving to strategic positions around the courtroom. Director Hayes stepped forward, producing additional documentation that outlined the scope of Sarah's investigation, revealing how she had meticulously gathered evidence of systemic corruption that extended far beyond Officers Thompson and Reynolds, their attempted frame-up of her, providing the final piece of evidence needed to bring down an entire network of dirty cops. Officer Thompson slumped in the witness stand as the judge described how Sarah had tracked their movements for months, documenting their connections to local criminal organizations while building an airtight case that would expose not only their individual corruption but also lead investigators to higher-ranking officers who had protected and profited from their illegal activities. The prosecutor's face cycled through shades of red and white as he realized his zealous prosecution had been part of Sarah's carefully orchestrated plan, his unwitting participation helping to expose the depth of prejudice and corruption that had infected the local justice system. While Chen stood beside his client, his earlier subtle confidence now reviewed as the assurance of someone who had been part of the operation from the beginning. Judge Harrison continued reading from the classified files, his voice growing stronger as he detailed how Sarah had allowed herself to be arrested, maintaining her cover, even as she was processed through the system, her every move calculated to expose the weaknesses and corruption that had festered within the department for years. The gallery watched in amazement as surveillance photos were displayed showing Sarah conducting her investigation, her technical expertise and strategic brilliance evident in the thoroughness of her documentation. While Officer Reynolds began to sway on his feet, the realization hitting him that their attempt to frame an innocent black woman had led them to target one of the most capable federal agents in the country. Sarah maintained her composed demeanor as her true identity and accomplishments were read into the record: her Yale education, extensive military service, and numerous successful operations, painting a picture of an extraordinary agent who had dedicated her life to exposing corruption and pursuing justice. While the jury members exchanged glances of astonishment and growing admiration, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor as Judge Harrison concluded his reading. The silence that followed filled with the weight of history, as everyone present realized they were witnessing a moment that would transform not only their local justice system but potentially law enforcement agencies across the country. While Sarah stood tall, her mission finally reaching its climactic moment, the courtroom transformed into a command center as Chen activated multiple display screens, his movements synchronized with CIA technical specialists who had emerged from the gallery, their equipment revealing a sophisticated surveillance operation that had captured every illicit meeting, every crooked deal, and every moment of corruption involving Officers Thompson and Reynolds. High-definition photographs flashed across the screens showing clandestine meetings in dimly lit parking garages, Thompson and Reynolds accepting thick envelopes from known crime bosses, their faces clearly illuminated by Sarah's sophisticated surveillance equipment, while timestamps and GPS coordinates provided irrefutable proof of their involvement in a criminal enterprise that stretched across state lines. Director Hayes stepped forward, narrating the evidence, his commanding voice providing context as video footage showed the officers protecting drug shipments, diverting evidence, and coordinating with criminal organizations, their activities documented in such meticulous detail that several jury members gasped audibly while others shook their heads in disbelief at the breadth of corruption before them. Sarah moved to stand beside a tactical display, her presence now commanding as she highlighted key moments in the investigation, pointing out patterns of behavior that connected the corrupt officers to larger criminal enterprises, her analytical skills on full display as she demonstrated how their attempt to frame her had inadvertently exposed their entire network. The surveillance footage continued showing meetings with other corrupt officers in different jurisdictions, the web of corruption expanding with each new image. While Thompson stared at the floor, unable to watch his crimes projected larger than life, and Reynolds had collapsed into a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands as years of illegal activities were laid bare before the court. Technical analysts wearing CIA credentials moved efficiently through the courtroom, setting up additional displays that showed financial transactions, shell companies, and offshore accounts that tied the officers to international criminal organizations, the scope of their corruption far exceeding anything the local prosecutor had imagined when he had so confidently taken on what he thought was a simple weapons case. Sarah manipulated a holographic display, her fingers dancing across the interface as she demonstrated how the officer's criminal activities had intersected with multiple ongoing federal investigations, her own operation merely one part of a larger effort to root out corruption in law enforcement agencies across the country. While the jury watched, transfixed by both the technology and the implications. The afternoon light caught the dust motes swirling through the air as document after document flashed across the screens: financial records, text messages, surveillance photos, and video clips, building an overwhelming case against the officers. While previously hidden CIA operators continued to emerge from their covered positions in the gallery, their presence revealing the true scale of the operation. Thompson began to visibly shake as Sarah displayed footage of him accepting payment for protecting a drug shipment, the high-resolution video showing every detail of the transaction. While Reynolds finally looked up, his face ashen as he recognized locations and meetings he thought had been completely secret, his years of careful criminality exposed by technology he hadn't known existed. The evidence continued to mount as Chen orchestrated the presentation, each new piece fitting perfectly into the larger puzzle, while Sarah provided expert commentary, her knowledge of the case revealing years of patient observation and documentation leading to this moment when every criminal act, every corrupt deal, and every abuse of power would be exposed to the light of justice. Director Hayes stood watching the presentation with fierce approval, while Judge Harrison took careful notes, his earlier shock transformed into grim determination as the true scope of the corruption became clear, and the jury members sat riveted, their earlier assumptions about the case completely upended by the mountain of evidence before them. The gallery had grown silent as the magnitude of the operation became clear, the regular spectators processing the realization that they had been surrounded by CIA operators all along, while Sarah continued her presentation, her voice steady and professional, as she outlined how this case would lead to dozens of arrests and the dismantling of multiple criminal enterprises operating within law enforcement agencies. U.S. Marshals emerged from strategic positions throughout the courtroom, their movements precise and coordinated as they converged on Officers Thompson and Reynolds, their tactical gear and weapons creating a sharp contrast against the formal atmosphere of the courthouse, while Sarah watched with professional satisfaction as the corrupt officers realized the full magnitude of their situation. Thompson attempted to stand from the witness box, his legs trembling so violently that he had to grip the railing for support as two marshals approached with handcuffs, while Reynolds remained frozen in place, his years of tactical training deserting him in the face of the overwhelming federal presence that had materialized around him like smoke solidifying into steel. The sound of multiple handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the hushed courtroom, a symphony of justice as both officers were secured, their badges and service weapons carefully removed and catalogued as evidence by CIA forensic specialists who had been disguised as court staff throughout the proceedings, their movements efficient and practiced. Sarah approached her former arresters, now standing at her full height, her CIA credentials gleaming in the afternoon light as she formally read them their rights, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority, while Thompson stared at her in disbelief, his mind struggling to process how the black woman they had attempted to frame had turned out to be one of the most formidable federal agents in the country. The jury watched in amazement as additional arrests began throughout the courthouse, CIA operators and federal agents moving with practiced precision to apprehend other corrupt officers who had been present to support their colleagues, their coordinated takedown, revealing the true extent of the operation that Sarah had orchestrated. Director Hayes stood with his arms crossed, satisfaction evident in his bearing as he watched his lead agent complete an operation that had taken 2 years of deep cover work to bring to fruition, while Judge Harrison observed the proceedings with a mixture of amazement and approval, his courtroom having become the staging ground for one of the largest police corruption takedowns in recent history. Thompson and Reynolds stood shoulder to shoulder, their former swagger replaced by defeated postures, as Sarah explained how their attempted frame-up had provided the final evidence needed to expose their entire corruption network, their racist assumptions about their target having led them to make the crucial mistake of targeting a highly trained federal operative. The gallery erupted in murmurs as more details emerged about how Sarah had allowed herself to be arrested, maintaining her cover even through booking and preliminary hearings, her patience and professionalism enabling her to gather crucial evidence about corruption within the justice system itself while building an airtight case against everyone involved. Chen gathered the evidence files, his earlier performance as a defense attorney now reviewed as part of an elaborate operation, while Sarah continued documenting the arrests, her tablet recording every detail for what would become a landmark case in the annals of federal law enforcement and anti-corruption operations. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor as Thompson and Reynolds were led toward the door, their hollow footsteps marking the end of their careers in law enforcement, while Sarah conferred with Director Hayes their quiet conversation, suggesting that this courthouse operation was merely the beginning of a much larger investigation. Federal agents efficiently processed the scene, collecting additional evidence and securing witnesses, while the jury sat transfixed by the transformation of what they had thought would be a routine weapons case into a massive federal operation that would send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the country. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor as she watched her former arresters being led away, her mission accomplished with a precision that would be studied in CIA training programs for years to come, while Thompson and Reynolds shuffled toward their fate, their attempt to abuse their power having led them directly into a trap of their own making. The setting sun painted the courthouse steps in shades of amber and gold as Sarah Anderson stood conferring with Director Hayes and a team of senior CIA operatives, their quiet conversation punctuated by the whirring of news helicopters circling overhead, while dozens of federal agents coordinated the transportation of the arrested officers to secure facilities across 3 states. Thompson and Reynolds sat in separate unmarked federal vehicles, their faces illuminated by flashing police lights, as Sarah discussed the next phase of the operation with her team, her tablet displaying a complex network of connections that linked the arrested officers to corruption cases in 12 different jurisdictions, while more evidence continued to pour in from ongoing raids. The evening news crews had descended on the courthouse like a swarm, their cameras capturing the historic moment as Sarah stood on the steps, her CIA credentials now openly displayed, while she gave a brief statement about the successful completion of Operation Clean Shield, her words carefully chosen to protect ongoing investigations while sending a clear message about the consequences of corruption. Director Hayes fielded questions from senior law enforcement officials who had arrived from neighboring states, their faces showing concern as they realized the implications of today's events for their own departments, while Sarah coordinated with FBI tactical teams who were simultaneously executing search warrants at multiple locations connected to the corrupt officers. The courthouse plaza had transformed into a command center with mobile intelligence units analyzing data in real time, their sophisticated equipment processing information from dozens of raids happening across the region, while Sarah maintained her calm professional demeanor, the satisfaction of a successfully completed mission visible only in the subtle curve of her lips. Chen packed away his legal documents, now revealed as carefully crafted elements of the operation, while conferring with federal prosecutors who had arrived to take custody of the evidence, his role as Sarah's handler during the deep cover operation having helped maintain her cover through months of careful preparation. The arrested officers watched from their separate vehicles as their former colleagues were led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, their corrupted brotherhood crumbling in the face of federal justice, while Sarah reviewed preliminary reports showing that the operation had already led to the discovery of offshore accounts containing millions in illegal profits. News anchors delivered breathless updates to their viewers as unmarked federal vehicles departed in different directions, their precious cargo of arrested officers bound for secure facilities where they would face questioning about their roles in a corruption network that had tentacles reaching into police departments across multiple states. Sarah stood at the center of the operation, her previous vulnerability replaced by commanding authority, as she coordinated with multiple agencies, ensuring that every piece of evidence was properly documented and secured, while the scope of the corruption her operation had exposed continued to expand with each passing hour. The evening air crackled with energy as federal agents processed seized electronic devices and documents, their preliminary findings suggesting connections to corrupt officials in positions far higher than anyone had initially suspected, while Sarah prepared for a secure briefing with Justice Department officials who had flown in specifically for this case. Director Hayes watched with pride as his lead operative efficiently managed the aftermath of her operation, her 2 years of deep cover work having led to what would become one of the most significant anti-corruption victories in recent law enforcement history, while the last rays of sunlight painted the courthouse in shadows. Thompson and Reynolds disappeared into the growing darkness as their transport vehicles pulled away, their careers and corruption ring collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane, while Sarah began preparing for the next phase of an operation that would send shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the country. The plaza gradually cleared of news crews and spectators, leaving Sarah with her core team as they prepared for a night of debriefings and coordination. Their work far from over as the full implications of their operation began to ripple through the law enforcement community, where the stars emerged above the courthouse that had witnessed justice prevailing over corruption.